So we're going to go ahead and get started because we do have an action-packed presentation, and I'm going to apologize in advance because we're going to move quickly through the content because there's a lot of content. So if you have questions, I want to leave time at the end for questions, so we're going to move quickly. But I created the presentation knowing that we were going to move quickly, so hopefully there's a lot of screenshots that help you understand what it is that we're trying to get across. This is a continuation of our summer how-to series, and today it's going to be focusing on modifications and continuing reviews. So we'll go over the metrics. It's been a while since we've shown you the metrics. We'll go over some staff updates, some just general announcements, and then we'll get into the modifications and continuing reviews. And so with the metrics, one thing I just want to point out is that the data that we show you on these slides, it's just one big bucket, right? It's the number of days, median days from submission to approval. And that doesn't tell you or us a whole lot about what opportunities there might be to actually improve the turnaround times. And so that is actually something that we're taking very seriously in the office. We've set up new studies so that we can drill into the different time points of a submission and really find out where we can improve the turnaround time. So I just want to point that out, that we take these metrics very seriously, and we actually have something in place within the office right now where we're talking through the different time points. But here's the total number of items that have been approved in the last 6 months and then in the last 30 days. I don't know that there's too much to say about this other than I continue to see about a really good trend with the reportable events. We're not seeing that spike back up to 100, so that's really great because then that allows Kelly and her team to focus on the reportable events where patient safety might have been put at risk. Here's the turnaround times for full board studies, and again, this is median turnaround times. You can see we're down to 48 days as of July 1st. Our goal is 45 days. For expedited new studies, our goal is 21 days, and we're currently at 44. With exempt submissions, our goal is also 21, so it's the same whether it's exempt or expedited, and we're currently at 35 days. And with Reliance, our goal is 10, but just like we've talked about a lot of times in Research Matters, the turnaround times for Rania and Bonita can be very dependent upon the ability for you to get documents from that external site, and sometimes they don't send documents quickly. So unfortunately, that's why we see sometimes the huge jumps in Reliance all over the place. So just some staff updates. I just wanted to point out that actually the day that AHARP left, Rima Patel was no longer with our office. She was gracious enough to stay through the AHARP site visit. So that is this position right here. It's been posted on the website. And then I have a position here on investigator relations. So both of those jobs are on the website, but they're both regulatory analysts. And if you have any interest in them, please either talk to Chuck or myself. And then some general announcements. So here's where we really get into the heavy stuff. So the first thing I just want to talk about is HIPAA authorizations. So there is currently, we're stamping HIPAA authorizations, but IRBs don't actually approve the HIPAA authorization. And so we want to make that very clear and very distinct that for standalone HIPAA authorizations, we're not actually approving the document. We just have to confirm that authorization is going to be obtained. And so we're no longer going to be stamping standalone HIPAA authorizations, but we got a process in place to help your sponsors and your study, everybody regulatory document this change. And so that's what that note to file is, and we'll get to that in just a second. So if a standalone HIPAA authorization is modified going forward, we're going to overwrite the stamped version in eIRB with the document that you have in front of you. So that way it will be there in the IRB record, it'll be there for you to download and put into your regulatory binder that as of this date, we are no longer stamping the standalone HIPAA authorizations. We will be uploading a non-stamped version to the Documents tab. And then we're also what we're gonna do is we're still gonna PDF the HIPAA authorization. We're not gonna stamp it, But there's that glitch in EIRB where all the PDFs are filtering up to the stamped consents section. And so if we PDF it, it'll actually filter up there, so that way the consent and the HIP authorization are still in the same section for the version that you should use with your subject. So we're going to do that. We're going to give you a version that you should use in future modifications, and we're going to give you a version that is right next to the consent form, so that way if you have a resident or a fellow who knows to go there and click, it'll still be right in that same section for the standalone HIP authorization. And so this is just a screenshot. I was in our development system last night playing around. So this is a standalone HIP authorization that had the stamp, and we're going to put the do not use in front of it. And if you click on that link and open it up, it'll bring up the memo to file that you have in front of you. You can see I uploaded a PDF version of the Form F, but we're not calling it stamped. So it's going to be the same exact version that's in Microsoft Word, but it's right next to your consent forms. And then here is the version of the Microsoft Word document that is locked to track changes and available for you to use in future modifications. And then this, just a quick screenshot of the memo to file. So everything that's in this memo I just described, please let us know if you have any questions. But we just want to be very clear about what we are approving and what we're not approving as an IRB. So. And then just one other thing, I know we've mentioned this in the past, but it's something that I think is really good to just keep talking about, that with EIRB, we have a very specific workflow within the office, and you are able to see that when we reassign a study, it's going from submitted, and then Chuck assigns it to an analyst, and then the analyst is assigning it to the IRB reviewer, and sometimes it bounces back and forth a couple times. And that is just all based on the study workflow that we've set up of how we review and approve studies. So that's why sometimes you're seeing a lot of reassignments. It's not necessarily slowing down the turnaround or anything like that. It really just pertains to how the study is flowing through our office. And sometimes you might see somebody like Chuck or myself or Rhonda go in and take ownership of it, because you may have called and asked us a question. In order for us to really go in and evaluate what your question means for the study, we go in, we take ownership, we help answer your question, and then we reassign it back to the analyst, so that way they're able to continue on with their peer review. So that's why sometimes you'll see sometimes what looks like just bouncing back and forth for no reason, but there's a really good reason for it. So we reassign and assign when it's initially submitted, when it's routed after the pre-review has been completed, when it's assigned to an IRB reviewer, and then sometimes if it's a full board study and we asked you a question and you had to go to the sponsor to get an answer, we may have to reassign it because it's going to a different board. We didn't want to defer it, so we get the answer, we send it to the next available board meeting, and then we're not waiting 2 to 4 weeks for a response to a deferral. Okay. Like I said, we're going to move fast through this because there's a lot of content. So summer how-to series with modifications. So starting off with the approved documents. Last summer, when we introduced EIRB Lite in September of 2018, all the documents that have been submitted and approved within the office have been finalized by investigator relations. And so what that means is we're codifying the documents. We're giving them the codes based on what's on the website. Form A's are the protocols. If it's an A, then it's an investigator-initiated protocol. A3 would be a sponsored protocol. So we codify the documents. The next thing we do is we name the documents. So after approval, we add in the STU number, the PI's last name. We keep that form code. We add in the submission that document was approved under, and then the approval date for that submission. Then what we do for Microsoft Word documents is we clean the document up, so if there's any track changes, any comments, we get rid of all of that. We insert a footer or update the footer if there's already a footer there based on the name that we just gave the document. We lock the document to track changes, and obviously we can only do this to Microsoft Word documents. But I think that's really important to reiterate because we cannot touch the PDF documents that you might be getting from sponsors or from other sites. We can't do anything like this to those documents. And then we upload those documents to the Documents tab. So the reason we do that is because the finalized documents are a versioning control system for you and for us. And the codes and naming convention give us a lot of information. So here again is that the naming convention right at a glance, if this was actually a real study, and we'll look at a screenshot of one of the fake studies I ran through the system last night, I have the study, whereas sometimes if I look at an older study where there's a consent form that just says consent form, if you send that to me, I don't necessarily know what study that's for. And EIRB doesn't have the most sophisticated searching capability, so I could search by title, but that might take a really long time. Having the STU number is really helpful for us. The PI last name, we know who the PI is right off the bat. The form code, I know exactly what that document is. The submission, so that tells us when this document was last updated. If I see mod 3, then I know that this document was updated with modification 3. And the approval date tells me when that particular submission was approved. So that's a lot of information within the name that gives everybody a lot of power to understand what this document is, when it was updated, all that sort of stuff. And then the reason we insert the footer is because as soon as we insert that footer and we lock the document to track changes, we know the most recently IRB approved version. And that's really important because before we did this, we didn't necessarily know that the version that you might submit in a modification is actually the version we last approved. And so what that meant in practical terms for our analysts is that we would open up the document and either compare and merge the documents in Microsoft Word, which is sometimes a really nice functionality, but not always the greatest functionality, or we would compare the documents almost line by line and word for word. And that's a lot of effort that we can get rid of if we have a really good version and control system. And the reason that we lock the documents to track changes is that if I give you the document, I say this is the version that's IRB approved, locking the document to track changes means that we absolutely know we are going to see every change that's made. Because I cannot tell you how many times somebody in the office will send me something like a guidance document, and I go in there and I start playing around, and then I realize everybody else is going to have to see what I'm changing. And I forgot to turn on track changes. So then I have to undo everything, turn on track changes, and turn it back on. And that's a really simple mistake to make, but the IRB has to see what those changes are, so they have to be tracked. The other reason we lock to track changes is because it makes sure that the changes are actually tracked and not necessarily tracked by using red font or italic font or underlined font, because we don't always get rid of those font changes when we finalize a document. We may see that there's a font change, but we don't necessarily know why this particular bullet is red and everything else is black, especially a couple years from now. We may not know that that was the track change. So what we do within the Documents tab is we upload the documents to the first section, Stamped Consent Documents for use with subjects. So that's the section that when we upload consent forms and PDF standalone HIPAA authorizations going forward, they'll show up there. So these are the versions that you should use to get consent from subjects and to obtain HIPAA authorization. Like I said at the beginning, we also know that there's currently a glitch in the system that all PDFs are filtering up there, and until that glitch is fixed, which it seems really easy to fix that, but it's been really difficult to figure out why that's broken, we're going to modify this particular title to say Stamped Consent Documents for Use with Subjects and all PDFs. And then the second section is the Approved Study Documents for Use in Future Modifications. So this is going to have every document that was reviewed and approved since September 2018. Prior to that, we didn't necessarily upload anything other than the protocol, and we didn't always upload a Word version of the consent form. We really just put in the stamped versions of the consent forms. But now we all know this is the list of the most recently approved documents, and so it gives us all a lot of power to just use this list to make all of our modifications. So like I said, PDF documents filter up to this section, and we're going to update that to reflect it. And actually, just earlier, a coordinator called me because we did update these titles in November of last year, and there were some potential deviations on the study that coordinator was working on. And so, if you ever need any documentation to show that these titles have changed, that email was sent on November 9th, 2018. I pulled it into my saved emails because it was in my archives, and it took 10 minutes to load up my archives to get to that email. So if you need it, let me know. So always check that second section to see if the study document has been finalized. Because we understand there's going to be some old studies, unfortunately we have some studies that are going back sometimes even into the 1980s. And because they haven't necessarily, not all documents have been modified since September of 2018, not every document is going to be in the second section. But as soon as you modify it, we are putting the version there. And if there is a version, so if you're talking about Form E, the main version of the consent document, not necessarily the pregnant partner version of the consent, if there is a Form E-main or however it's been named, in that second section, use that version. Because if you submit it to the office, it ensures that the versioning control system works. And if you don't use that final version, that is the first step of the analyst pre-review, is look at the document, look at the footer, and see if that document matches the version that's in the second section of the Documents tab. And if it's not a match, then we send it back and say, here's the version that you should be using, because we know this is the most recently approved version. So we know that because we're locking the documents to track changes, clean versions can't be submitted to us, and that's by design. If anybody showed up to the EIRB Lite training last summer, I actually touched on this and specifically said, why give us a clean version when we haven't agreed that these are the most appropriate changes? Let's all agree what the changes should be, maybe how language should read, and once we have a version with all the track changes and we all agree that it's okay, we'll give you a clean version back. So that's by design, it's okay. We will clean the documents up and release the clean version back to you. That's something that investigator relations does for you. And so here's a screenshot. I just went through a lot of words, but I wanted to show all that stuff. I played with this a lot last night to figure out where should I show the screenshot. But I wanted to talk through all that and then kind of show the screenshots. So this is that first section, the stamped consent documents for use with subjects and the approved study documents for use in future modifications. And then this is the section where you can automatically tell that the protocol was updated with Mod 1. But the recruitment and enrollment document, Form C, where you're giving us the inclusion-exclusion criteria, how you're going to recruit subjects, how you're going to enroll them, what's your plan for non-English speaking subjects, and what is the plan for returning clinically relevant research results if you are going to return them. That didn't change. So whatever you changed in Mod 1, it didn't actually affect anything to do with inclusion-exclusion criteria, recruitment and enrollment, and right off the bat, I know a lot of information about this study. So, and just to kind of show you, so this is Form A, and so I just want to point out that we're going to be using the same study number, the 2018-0028, as we go through the presentation. So this is the Form A that I finalized as I was playing, and then this is a blow-up of that bottom section where you can see the footer that I entered. And you can see that it doesn't say Form A, NS for the new study, but it says Mod 1, 7/15/19. So that footer gets updated every time you submit the document back to us. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that when you look at the document inside Microsoft Word, this is a shot of the ribbon in Microsoft Word. You can't turn the track changes off, and you can't accept the track changes. And again, this is by design. We want you to track all your changes, send that in to us in the modification smart form, and then we will clean it all up and give it back to you. So, but I've had a lot of people call in and say, why can't I accept the track changes? And that is all by design with our versioning control system since we went live with EIRB Lite. But I just wanted to point that out, that when you see this, this is all okay. So then the other thing to just mention with modifications is only upload a revised document or a new document in the modification smart form. The reason for that is because if you upload documents into the parent smart form or into supporting documents, which is one of my biggest pet peeves about EIRB, or any other location, we may not necessarily know that it was really meant to be part of that modification. If you put it in the modification, we know that you're either adding it or you're revising it. Supporting documents can be really helpful For example, if an analyst sends an email to you and says, hey, you didn't give me the Clean IB investigator's brochure, you can send an email back and say, well, I just uploaded it in the supporting documents, and then we'll go in and grab it and put it in the right section for you. But that's really the way that supporting documents should be utilized, not necessarily to put something there, because if you don't tell us that it's there, we don't know that. There's no tracking of what's changed or anything like that. We don't get notified if you upload something. So it's really good to communicate back and forth when you let us know that you're doing that during a submission. So the other thing to just kind of note with modifying documents is that with EIRB Lite, when we rolled that out, we rolled out that the study approval letters will automatically pull in the documents, and it will pull in the documents the way that you named them. And so that's really important, because sometimes your sponsors are very particular about the way they want a document to be named in the approval letter. And we understand that, so if you will upload your protocol and call it protocol version 5, and the version date of that protocol is 9/15/18, great. Now the sponsor sees exactly what they want to see inside the approval letter, and then we will still rename and codify the document. So even though we're releasing the documents back to you with our new naming convention, the approval letters still show what you named it. And so this gives you a lot of power. For example, we did have a protocol that was reviewed and approved, and it was the initial approval, and the consent form, when it was uploaded into EIRB, was named Response to Stipulations Memo from Sponsor. So then inside the approval letter, that's how the consent form showed up. And then that person emailed me and said, hey, my sponsor needs you to revise the approval letter. And I said, well, that's the way that you named your consent form. I can't revise the approval letter, because then I'd be changing really what the content of the submission was. That's how you named it. So it gives you a lot of power. It allows you to make sure that your approval letters list exactly what you need the sponsors to see, and then we'll rename it. So that was definitely by design when we went live with EIRB Lite. But the other thing to just mention is that the letters are only going to pull documents from the SMART form that you submitted. So whether it's a new study, a modification, a continuing review, or a reportable event, when we pull up that letter in the system, that letter is going to the SMART form, not to, if it's a modification, it's not going to the parent, it's not going to the last continuing review, it's only going to the modification SMART form that is currently being reviewed to say what documents are there, and let me pull in those document names. So that's the other reason why it's really important that you only upload the new or revised documents inside the modification SMART form for modifications, because if you upload it in the parent SMART form, if it's a new consent document and you put it in old section 54 or new 6.12, don't quote me on that, then the letters will not see it, and then your sponsors may say, well, the IRB didn't document approval of this new consent form. So here's just a screenshot of the approval letter, and you can see that I was lazy, I'm not gonna lie. I didn't name these in any specific manner. I literally went to the website, I downloaded the forms, and then I uploaded them into the system. But that's how I named them, and then when I released, sorry, I didn't put in a screenshot of that. When I released those back as the IRB person approving it, I did not call it form _B_study_personnel. It was the naming convention. So I just wanted to point that out, that this is how myself as the Rhonda, because I was logged in as Rhonda. Rhonda is the PI on the study. So I was logged in as Rhonda. Rhonda submitted the study like this with Form B, study personnel, and then as the IRB member who approved it, I called it the way that we just talked about. So again, just make sure that your documents are only uploaded in the modification SMART form. But this does not necessarily apply to those text questions, to the checkbox questions, to the radio button questions. If a protocol changes the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and this is an old EIRB study where you listed out what the inclusion-exclusion criteria were, you still have to go to the parent SMART form and change the text if it's applicable. And that's why during the EIRB Lite training, we also said it's okay to say, see section 1 of the protocol to answer this particular question. So this is a screenshot of what you see when you're inside the modification. The top one allows you to edit the modification smart form, and the bottom one allows you to edit the parent smart form and any of the appropriate changes that you might need to make. So for the example, in the modification smart form, the brief summary was that we're going to send data to new collaborators. So we've identified New York University, and they're going to be involved in the study, or any other collaborator. So that documents that the data is going to be shared with other people. That's what the modification is. And then inside the new EIRB Lite smart form, this is the current state. So I created the modification smart form. I went in there and I told the mod I'm going to update and I'm going to share data with new people. Inside the parent smart form, it still says that I'm not going to be shipping data or specimens to other facilities. But as soon as I click yes, then it actually asks me the questions. So that's why you still sometimes have to go into the parent smart form and make sure you're updating the questions as appropriate. Don't put your documents in there, but just update text questions, radio questions, and the checkbox questions. So then the next thing to talk about with modifications is the modification type. So make sure you're selecting the correct modification type. There's minor changes, there's major changes, there's administrative changes, and there's relying on a non-UT Southwestern IRB changes. And I put those in there in that order because that's exactly how they show up in EIRB. And making sure that you select the right modification type helps us route that modification in the system. So if you want to know how that works, Chuck is the person who does all of those assignments, and you can pick his brain about how this affects your modifications. But he's looking at the mods to determine what's going to go where within the office. And so this is a screenshot of those same things I just showed you. And then to go through them, so the minor modifications, I thought about pulling in the definition from our policy and procedure manual, but it was long and wordy, and I didn't want to put that on the slides for all the different modification types. But if you don't know what sort of modification yours is, go to our policy procedure manual, look at the modifications policy, because after the modifications policy, we have 2 really great pages of tables to say, this is the potential change you're making, and it's in either a major modification or a minor modification. So it helps give some guidance to both you and to us about what sort of change this is. So with minor modifications, we're talking about clarifications, new minimal risk procedures, recruitment methods, new or modified safety monitoring procedures that actually decrease the risks. With major changes, we're looking at major changes to study design. So, sometimes this, that's maybe somewhat vague depending on how you read that. And so my example would be, we had a study that was randomized, and now after we're going through it, it's just not feasible, so the PI is proposing to change the study to a non-randomized study. That's a pretty major change. New or increased risk, so it's either a new risk or the risk is higher in severity than we thought, it's happening more frequently, or it's more severe than we had thought. Change in the use of study drugs, so are you adding a drug? Now, this does not necessarily mean that we're using a drug like prednisone on the study, which is available from a variety of manufacturers. The hospital was buying it from manufacturer 1, and now they're buying it from manufacturer 2. That is not a major change. That is potentially even administrative change, because you're just using whatever vendor the hospital has deemed as best to care for the patients. But this would be, we're adding a new drug. New more than minimal risk procedures. So based on the new risks that we're seeing, we have to start doing a CT scan on these patients to evaluate lung capacity, or something that you would evaluate on a CT. Not clinical, so forgive me. Or new or revised procedures involving radiation. So if we're adding radiation, if we're increasing the radiation, then it's a major modification. And then potentially we do see some studies sometimes that after some interim analysis, everything looks really great, and so the sponsor says, listen, we're going to pull back on maybe doing some of these safety labs because we can reduce costs, we can reduce visits. But if you're going to reduce the safety monitoring procedures, that's something that could be a major change. So the admin modifications, those are going to be changes to study personnel, but not including PI changes. We've built into EIRB Lite that new PI changes go back to the department reviewer, whether it's the same department approver or a different department. So it's going to go back through that routing process, and that's why they're not administrative. So if you need to change co-investigators, other study personnel, non-affiliated study personnel, primary research coordinator, or the primary administrative contact, that is all the other roles in the system other than PI, that's administrative. Minor administrative or grammatical changes to the study material. So if you submitted a consent form and you had a bunch of grammatical mistakes, so having worked in the HRPP office, I have started spelling worse. I don't know why that is, but I guarantee that if I submitted a consent form, there would be a lot of spelling errors. So if somebody else wanted to correct those on my behalf, that would be an administrative change. But those changes cannot change the meaning of the document. So if we're saying, I thought I typed in an example there. So if we're saying that we're going to go from randomized to non-randomized, or we're changing that this means no and now it's going to mean yes, any sort of example like that that's really changing the meaning, the context of the document, then that would not be an administrative change, and we'd have to evaluate if it's minor or major at that point. And then relying, this is going to be any change where the UT Southwestern has ceded review to another IRB. And if you have any questions about how to process those, Rania is really the best source. So she can walk you through how to submit those modifications where we're relying on a non-UT IRB. So then the next question in the modification is the modification categories. It doesn't actually have a question, it just says select that all that apply. So I called them categories. Make sure you're selecting the category for what's changing. So if you change risks within the protocol and there's a consent document, I would hazard a guess that the consent document also needs to be updated. And so this, make sure that you're choosing both protocol and consent, because then we know that you're changing both documents. Selecting protocol means that you may not even be prompted to attach the revised consent document. We may not know that you're adding a new consent document, because each section within the modification smart form has important questions for that type of change. So they're separate sections because we want to make sure that we're capturing information for each of the changes that you're making. And so here's a screenshot of all the different categories. So I wanted to show some screenshots. So this is just a screenshot of the personnel section, and there's a lot of things here, so that's why it's just the tiniest little screenshot of 3.0, the personnel changes. So if you select personnel changes and the study is an EIRB Lite study, you have a Form B, and you may need to update that Form B. And I say may because if you had a person who is currently approved on the study and they move from other study personnel to primary administrative contact, that may not change what's on Form B, and that's okay. But if you're adding new people, deleting people, that will change Form B. And so we want to make sure, here's the questions that actually say, does it affect the consent form? Because there's still a lot of consent forms where you have all the co-investigators or sub-investigators and research coordinators listed on the first page. Do the personnel changes affect the research team responsibilities? And that's Form B. So based on your changes, have you deleted people that were on Form B? Have you added people that weren't there? And you want to make sure that you're answering that question correctly and including personnel changes in your categories if you're making that. So that means making the changes within the modification smart form means that we're tracking those changes. So we have had some submissions recently where the modification is submitted, personnel changes are not selected on the modification, the changes are made within the parent smart form. There's no tracking. So we don't know that necessarily you've added new people in the parent smart form and deleted people. The modification smart form tracks all that and lets us review that very quickly to determine if everything is appropriate. So sticking with section 3, it also shows all the education. So it pulls that forward. So here's other study personnel. This is development, so don't judge Rhonda too harshly for not having completed HSP education, because she has done it. I went into City last night to verify it, but it's development, so that's why it's not there. I even spent about 5 minutes thinking, Should I go in and pull another study personnel? Should I just delete her? But anyway, she has done her education. But it shows that, so we can all see who has valid education. And when you make a personnel change, we go in and look to see, do the personnel who have changed, do they have valid education? So we don't go back and re-adjudicate all the prior changes. We're only looking at the changes being submitted. But if you add somebody to the study who has not done all the required training or have a current conflict of interest statement, we can't approve that personnel mod. And approving personnel mods takes, sometimes 30 seconds. So if everything is up to date when you submit it, we can approve that very quickly. So with protocol changes, making sure that you select Section 9 asks appropriate questions about the protocol. And so this is where I'm going to go back to some of the first slides where I talked about we can only do the cleaning up, the locking to track changes in the footer to Microsoft Word documents. If your sponsor is giving you a PDF protocol, I can't clean that up. And so if you submit a track changes version of the protocol and you don't give us a clean, that's the only version that I could potentially finalize for you. But then your sponsors are going to see that we've approved a track changes version of the protocol. And I don't think any of us want that. And same thing with summary of changes. So if your protocols or your investigator brochures, sometimes recruitment materials, any sort of validated questionnaire, anything like that you're getting in PDF from the main site, from the sponsor, whoever it is, if they're giving it to you in PDF, make sure that you're getting a summary of changes and or a track changes version with red line changes and giving us a clean version. So from an investigator relations standpoint, that is one of our biggest hangups, is that we download the documents, we see that there's no clean version, and we have to call you and say, hey, send it to me, and as soon as you send it to me, I'll approve it, process all the documents, but I can't move forward until I get that. So here's where we say that in 9.1.1. So we made sure we actually added this, I believe, in November with the other changes, to upload a clean version of the protocol if it's provided in PDF. And we say the same thing in the investigator brochure section. We say the same thing in the recruitment section. So we try to prompt you that, oh, remember, you need to give us the clean. Okay, so it's a little bit of a soapbox moment, but what does not equal why? And I really wanted to pull up a poll everywhere and have everybody put in their results of whether or not what equals why, but time didn't necessarily permit that. But what does not equal why? So in terms of real examples, if I go to any of you and say, hey, I have to take out a kidney, that's the what, and I think all of you would ask why before I could just go in and take out your kidney. So we want to make sure that we're getting both the what and the why. So here's the what, provide a brief summary of the modification. What are you changing? That's the what. And here's the why. Provide the reason for initiating that modification. And so, again, soapbox moments a little bit, forgive me, but even for study personnel changes, the what is different from the why, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But the other thing, before I get to the examples, is that 1.3 requests a brief summary. And whatever you put into 1.3 is going to be pulled into your modification approval letter. So if you write 12 paragraphs, copying and pasting from the sponsors of what's changing, that's what's going to be in the approval letter. So if you give us a brief summary, that will be hopefully a much better version of the approval letter for future review. So with personnel changes, the what is we're adding research coordinators and residents. The why is several coordinators have left the study team and new residents have begun the program. So they're different, and I understand that it's maybe cutting a fine line, but there is a difference between what and why. And when we're talking sometimes about personnel changes, if you've told us that you absolutely need to have a pharmacist engaged in the study to help protect participants, and your pharmacist leaves, then we have to question, what is your plan for protecting the participants without a pharmacist on hand? So that's why it can be really important to know the what and the why, even with personnel changes. But here's some more examples. So sponsor-provided protocol updates. So the what is that the study protocol has been updated to version 6.0. And then inside the summary of changes, there's a really great summary of changes. And I wrote this very briefly because I wanted to fit it on one slide, but if you want to give us more information, the main highlights about 6.0, that is definitely fine. But I wanted to keep it kind of condensed for the slide. But the why is that new risks have been identified and the protocol has been updated to reflect those risks. The why is not necessarily that the sponsor sent you 6.0. So, but we get that a lot. So just having that helps us also make sure that if you maybe clicked minor by mistake, we'll select major and then get it to a board for review as quickly as possible. Inclusion, exclusion criteria changes. So the what is that we're adding a history of hypertension as exclusion. The why is that interim study results have shown that the study drug may increase the likelihood of hypertension. That gives us a lot of information right there all about what's actually happening on the study. And change in sponsor, so what sponsor is changing from X to Y. The why, or the why is not necessarily that the sponsor is changing, but that company Y has been more successful and they bought out company X. So good for company Y. So that's all the things with the modification smart form. Moving on to the continuing reviews. And just a quick note, so EIRB doesn't allow simultaneous continuing reviews in MODS right now. And we know that that can potentially be a burden. It's a burden for you. It's a burden for us because everything you submit, we have to review and approve. So we understand the pain that sometimes you can be in. We can assist with making administrative changes to the study during continuing reviews. And I bolded and underlined administrative because those things do not require IRB review. And if there's an IRB review required, whether it's minor or major, we want to make sure that we're documenting that separately in a modification. So if you're making any personnel updates, any grammatical changes to consent forms, especially if you have a person who's left and they were listed on the first page of the consent form, don't submit that in a separate modification. Put that in section 14 of the continuing review and we'll update it for you. If you have translated documents, so if you've ever worked with me in TransPerfect translations, some people have asked, well, I currently have a continuing review and what can we do to get this approved? Put it in the continuing review and we'll get it approved. And if it's an expedited continuing review, I may just go in and approve it right now. So make sure that you're uploading those into section 14. That's just the other documents and you can have an attachment point. And then when we download all documents for that continuing review, we will see those documents, we'll finalize them, and we'll upload them both to the Parent Smart Form and to the Documents tab. Okay, so then with continuing reviews, one of the easiest things that you can do that will help us process continuing reviews is making sure that everybody who's on the study has up-to-date education and conflict of interest statements. So at time of modification, we are only evaluating the changes. But at continuing review, everybody has to have valid education and conflict of interest statements. And so what that means is that with human subjects research, the HSR, as it shows up in EIRB, that's required every 3 years. And if you ever have anybody who doesn't know how to go in and add the new module and not just recomplete the module, please contact anybody in the office. We will go into their profile in City and add the training for them. So when they go in, they see something that's not completed and they won't recomplete the same training. If they complete the same training, City doesn't care, they won't give them, or the system will not give them credit, and they'll have to do double training. Good clinical practice is required every 3 years if it's an applicable clinical trial, and if you have any questions about what that means, we outline that very clearly in our policy procedure manual. And then conflict of interest statements would be annually and within 30 days of any change in interest. You'll notice I didn't include HIPAA here because HIPAA is a one-time completion. So if somebody has HIPAA in the system, all we see is the date and then move past it. So if you evaluate this before you submit your continuing review, we can, especially if it's a minimal risk continuing review, we can process that pretty quickly. But that is one of the biggest things that we notice at continuing reviews is that education is not up to date. So then the next thing with continuing reviews is study status. So what is the enrollment status of the study? And the logic in the SMART form, there's a lot of logic based on this particular question. And then questions 1.3, 1.1, 1.3, and 1.4, how you answer those may mean that we can send a study that was full board review, it was more than minimal risk, through expedited review procedures. So here's a screenshot of 1.1, the study status. So if we select option 1, where no participants have been enrolled to date, we actually, I made a mistake here, I didn't include that questions 1.3 and 1.4 are skipped, You skip section 2 where you give us the enrollment numbers because there are no enrollment numbers. And if you had a more than minimal risk study, we may be able to review that by expedited procedures. I don't want to say always, but normally that's the case. And if you select option 5 or 6, where we're saying that procedures have completed and we're at long-term follow-up only, or we're at data analysis only, then again, those full board studies that were originally approved as more than minimal risk, we may be able to review those via expedited procedures. So that gives us a lot of ability to help you out. I understand that sometimes there's a lot of studies floating around, you're juggling a lot of different balls, and if you have a study that is going to expire tomorrow, and it's a more than minimal risk study, but you're at data analysis, we can approve that within the office. But if you're still enrolling patients, we can't approve that within the office. We'd actually have to have a convened meeting. So then question 1.2, where we're talking about the status. Status 1 and 2 really refer to, are we doing something with the subject right now? That's status 1. And then status 2 is that we're not doing any research procedures right now, but we will in the future. Most likely, we're going to have to send that study through full board review if it was more than minimal risk. But if it's a full board study and it is status 3, where we're not doing anything right now and we don't have plans to do anything in the future with subjects, that may be eligible for expedited review. And then question 1.3, what are you doing? So you said in 1.2 that you are doing something, or you're going to do something in the future. Are those things minimal risk activities? So are you doing minimal risk interactions, having people take surveys? Are those interventions things that would happen as part of standard of care, or are you just doing data collection? And if you say yes to that, then we may be able to send a full board study through expedited review. So we ask those 3 questions because they're distinct, and it helps us collect information to determine what sort of review applies for this study. And then question 3.2 allows you to further define any procedures that you might be completing. And if you define what those procedures are, and they're all minimal risk procedures, or they're all long-term follow-up procedures, or anything that fits into 1.3, then again, a full board study may be eligible for expedited review. So moving on with enrollment, so 2.1.1 or 2.2.1, 2.2.2 must equal 2.2.3. And this used to be one of the biggest issues, probably bigger than the education, but we added validation. So now you cannot submit a continuing review where 2.2.1 and 2.2.2 do not equal 2.2.3. Forgive me for quoting the numbers exactly. And just to point out that even chart reviews are going to enroll subjects. So if you have looked at 1,000 charts for your study, then how many people were reported as enrolled and consented, that's going to be how many charts you've looked at. And so that's one of the questions that we get a lot of times, is that I was approved for a chart review, I don't know how to fill out section 2. And it's how many charts have you looked at? How many charts do you no longer need to look at? So then this is a screenshot of, you've told us how many people have enrolled in the past year, enrolled in previous years. Now give us the breakdown of everybody who's enrolled, who's currently active, who's completed, and has anybody withdrawn. So 2.2.4, how many people are currently active? 2.2.5, how many people have completed? And 2.3.7, which is an auto calculation of everybody who has withdrawn, must equal 2.2.3, the total number of people who have been enrolled. So if anybody's been a screen failure, if anybody, all the people who are currently active, we have to have all that match up. And again, this used to be one of the biggest issues, but we added validation. So now the system will give you red text and say, wait, go back and add all that up because it's not adding up right now. And if you do have anybody who withdrew by their choice or were withdrawn by the PI, make sure you document the reasons why. Because if we see that a PI withdrew a subject, we really want to know why that happened. And it can be as simple as the subject was non-compliant. Unfortunately, we know that that happens. And we want to know that that actually tells us a lot, that the PI is monitoring what's happening with the study and saying, this person's not good for the study anymore. With the vulnerable populations, make sure that whatever you put into this box matches what you're currently approved for. So don't lie to us. Don't enroll a child and then not report it at continuing review if you're not approved for children. Tell us that you enrolled a child. But don't enroll children if you're not approved to enroll children. So that's an important distinction. Don't withhold any information from us. But the other thing to just note is that there's no validation. There's no adding within the system to say these things have to match up, because you could have a subject who's both a child and a pregnant woman. And so that wouldn't allow us to necessarily add that up to the number of people who have completed and active. So we don't have any validation around these numbers. So moving ahead to section 3 or 6, where we're talking about the status of enrollment, make sure that 6.3, where we're talking about is it approved to enroll non-English speaking subjects, matches the approval in the Parent Smart Form. And unfortunately, this is an issue more often than you might think, where you say, yes, you are approved to enroll non-English speaking subjects, and you say, and you're not, or you say, no, we're not approved for that, but you actually are. So make sure that those two things match. And then just note that if you are approved to enroll non-English speaking subjects in the IRB, you suggested to the IRB that you're going to use a fully translated consent document. That was going to be the process by which you would consent these subjects. And you've enrolled a subject during the last review, potentially with a short form. At continuing review, we're going to require that that fully translated document be submitted to us, because that was the plan that you proposed to the IRB, and that's the plan that the IRB approved. So that is the point where we kind of enforce that you told us this was the plan, now follow through on the plan to get the fully translated document. And then just note that if you enroll non-English speaking subjects when they're not an approved population, that would be considered non-compliance. So make sure that you're thinking about, when you're setting up new studies, should this study enroll non-English speaking subjects? Should it not? Do we need to do some sort of exercise procedure, or we need to communicate in real time? All that sort of stuff. Think about it, and then submit your study with that plan in place. And then lastly, with section 10, make sure that 10.1 matches what the IRB approved for the data safety monitoring plan. So if you told us that there is going to be a data safety monitoring board, don't say no, there's no data safety monitoring entity. And ask your sponsors for the report, because I've been a research coordinator, and unfortunately I didn't work with the greatest CRO. They weren't the most organized, and unless I asked them for the DSMB report, I didn't get it. So ask them. And if they don't have one, it's okay to ask them, when are they next going to meet? Because the sponsor has outlined when the DSMB is going to meet, how often. And if they're not meeting those expectations, it's one way that you can help hold them accountable. You told me they were going to meet yearly. Why aren't they meeting yearly? Ask the questions, because those are the sorts of questions that the IRB may be asking. And if you give us the answers up front, it helps us make sure we're approving the studies. And then lastly, if the report's not available, we require a reason, so that's why it's really important to ask. Oh, they're going to meet in a month. Great, okay. Well, you can either submit it at the next continuing review, or if there's really important findings, submit it as a reportable event. So if they're recommending that the study shut down, call us. So that's everything. And I got through in about the time that I expected. So what questions do you have? There's a lot of content, I understand. Yeah. So what you're saying is, in the new protocol, there's a patient, maybe in Epic, whose language is noted as a non-English language, but they're saying to you they're comfortable with using an English language consent form. Yes, just make sure you document that conversation, that they said this is the version they're comfortable with. Sometimes Epic, the registration people, put in a language that may not be actually what the patient prefers. So that's okay. Yes. Correct.
We're basically not supposed to use that anymore.
Well, so that's a really good question, because so the question was, at the very end of the modification form, when you get to that summary page, there's the link to jump to the parent smart form. In the old modification smart form, we had a link to move to the parent smart form to make your changes on every page. What we did is we just moved that link to the very end, because in my opinion, and the reason we kind of made some of the changes, if I'm filling out the modification smart form, I just want to fill out that form, tell you all the changes that I'm making, and then go make the appropriate changes in the parent smart form, not jump back and forth, because there was no way to jump from the parent back to where you were at in the modification. So we just moved the link to the very end. You can still definitely use that link because it just sends you to the parent, and if you need to update some text, you need to change a checkbox from yes to no or whatever it is, then that's what that link is there for. Right, but you are not uploading the clean versions into the parent smart form. Right, edits to the smart form only, not clean documents. Yes?
But to add on to that, so you can upload a clean protocol, just not clean consents and others.
Upload the clean protocol in the modification. Yeah. So if it's a PDF protocol that you got in clean and track changes, the question will prompt you for both the red line version or summary of changes, whatever you get, and the clean. It's a good question. Any other questions? Wow, that was simple. I thought this was going to be a lot more. Have a great day. We'll see you in August for reportable events.